The Vampire King's blood could cure any disease, but he'd never given it freely until the desperate orphan girl showed him her mother's medical chart. His hand moved toward his wrist to cut it open. Except the DNA test results tucked behind the chart would destroy everything he thought he knew about the woman dying upstairs, the woman he'd loved and lost centuries ago, who'd apparently lived long enough to give him a daughter. Elena Thorne pressed her palm against the rusted iron grate, her fingers trembling as she calculated the drop into the ancient sewer system beneath the Vampire King's fortress. The medical chart crinkled against her chest, where she had tucked it inside her jacket, alongside the DNA test results that could change everything if anyone discovered them. 3 weeks of sleepless nights had led to this moment. 3 weeks since Dr. Martinez had delivered the death sentence with clinical precision, his voice echoing in the sterile hospital room as he explained that Sarah Thorne had perhaps 14 days before her rare blood disorder claimed her life. Elena had nodded politely, shaken his hand, and walked directly to the university library to begin research that would consume her savings and sanity. The cracked glass vial in her pocket caught the moonlight filtering through the grate above as she lowered herself into the darkness, landing with a splash in water that smelled of centuries and secrets. Her mother had raised her on stories of things that went bump in the night, never knowing that Elena would one day need to find them. The fortress above loomed like a Gothic cathedral, its spires piercing the cloudy sky, while gargoyles watched with stone eyes that seemed to track her movement. Elena had bribed Marcus Kellerman, a disgraced antiquities dealer, with her college fund to learn that the Vampire King Aldrich Ravencrest kept residence here, in this ancient stronghold that existed on no modern maps but appeared in whispered legends and banned historical texts. She waded through knee-deep water, following the building's foundation, searching for the entrance Kellerman had described with shaking hands and frightened eyes. The tunnel branched into 3 directions, each passage carved from stone so old it predated any civilization she recognized. Elena chose the middle path because her mother had always said the middle way was safest, though nothing about infiltrating a vampire fortress at midnight qualified as safe. Her flashlight beam danced across walls that bore strange symbols, neither Latin nor any language she had studied, but somehow familiar in a way that made her skin crawl. The passage sloped upward, and she could hear the faint sound of classical music echoing from somewhere above, violin strings weeping through stone corridors. Elena had studied architectural plans for 3 days, memorizing the building's layout from a blueprint stolen from the city planning office, though she suspected the underground portions were far older than any official records. The sewer connected to a wine cellar through a maintenance shaft that hadn't been sealed properly, an oversight that would either save her mother's life or end her own. She climbed the rusted ladder, her muscles aching from weeks of poor sleep and stress-induced nausea, until she reached another grate that opened into darkness thick as velvet. Elena paused, listening for footsteps or voices, but heard only her own ragged breathing and the distant violin that seemed to mourn for losses she couldn't name. The wine cellar smelled of oak barrels and time itself, rows of bottles standing like silent sentries in the shadows. She moved between them carefully, grateful for the months she had spent practicing stealth while volunteering at the animal shelter, learning to move quietly around sleeping creatures who might bolt at the slightest sound. Her research had revealed that vampire guards were notoriously light sleepers, but also that they relied more on supernatural senses than technology, making human determination a potential advantage. Elena found the door exactly where the building plans indicated, though the ornate brass handle was newer than the rest of the cellar's fixtures, suggesting recent renovations to accommodate modern security concerns. She pressed her ear against the wood, counting heartbeats until she felt confident the corridor beyond was empty, then turned the handle with the slow precision of someone whose mother's life depended on silence. The hallway stretched before her like something from a museum, lit by sconces that cast dancing shadows across tapestries depicting scenes of battle and romance. Elena had never seen artwork this old outside of textbooks, but she forced herself to focus on navigation rather than admiration, as she followed the path toward the main staircase. Every step felt like a small betrayal of common sense, but common sense hadn't saved her mother when conventional medicine failed, hadn't provided alternatives when the insurance company denied experimental treatments, hadn't offered hope when the specialist shrugged and suggested palliative care. The Vampire King's blood could cure any disease according to the forbidden texts Elena had discovered in a private collector's basement library, texts that described miraculous healings performed by creatures who walked between life and death. She climbed marble stairs that gleamed even in the dim light, each step bringing her closer to a confrontation that would either damn her or deliver salvation. The music grew louder as she ascended, revealing itself as a violin concerto played with supernatural skill, notes so pure they seemed to bypass her ears and resonate directly in her chest. Elena reached the second floor and paused before an archway that led toward the source of the music, knowing instinctively that she would find the Vampire King in whatever room lay beyond that threshold. Her hand moved to the vial in her pocket, checking its integrity one final time as she prepared to face a legend that most people dismissed as folklore. The DNA test results crinkled against the medical chart as she adjusted her jacket, and Elena wondered if she would live long enough to regret bringing them tonight. She had run the test in secret, using samples from her mother's medical records and her own blood, hoping to understand why conventional treatments weren't working, but discovering something far more impossible in the genetic markers that matched patterns she had never seen before. Elena stepped through the archway and found herself in a study that belonged in a palace, walls lined with books that must have spanned centuries, their leather bindings worn smooth by countless readings. Aldrich Ravencrest sat behind a mahogany desk that could have served as an altar, his violin resting across his lap as he regarded her with eyes that held depths no 30-year-old face should possess. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were, all sharp angles and perfect proportions. But what struck Elena most was his complete lack of surprise at finding an intruder in his private sanctuary. The mirrors throughout the room reflected his image clearly, dispelling her assumptions about traditional vampire mythology and forcing her to recalibrate everything she thought she knew about his nature. Elena pulled the medical chart from her jacket, with hands that barely shook, surprising herself with her steadiness as she approached his desk like a supplicant approaching a throne. She had practiced this moment in her mirror for 3 days, rehearsing words that would convince rather than beg, arguments that would appeal to logic rather than mercy. But facing him now, she realized that all her preparation had been theater performed for an audience of one terrified girl. Aldrich set his violin aside with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed, then gestured toward the chair across from his desk, as if midnight visitors requesting miraculous cures were routine occurrences in his ancient life. Elena remained standing, because sitting would make her feel like a petitioner rather than a negotiator, and she needed every advantage her research and determination could provide. She spread the medical chart across his desk with the precision of someone who had memorized every page, every test result, every doctor's note that chronicled her mother's descent toward death. Aldrich leaned forward to examine the documents, his expression shifting from amused tolerance to sharp attention as he read Sarah Thorne's full medical history. Elena watched his face for signs of recognition, remembering the strange questions her mother had asked about her research, the way Sarah's eyes had darkened when Elena mentioned pursuing supernatural solutions to medical problems. The Vampire King's fingers traced the timeline of symptoms with the delicacy of someone handling precious artifacts. And Elena noticed that his reflection in the desk's polished surface showed none of the classical vampire tells her research had described. He read every page with the thoroughness of someone who understood both medical terminology and supernatural implications, occasionally glancing up at Elena with an expression that suggested she looked familiar in ways he couldn't quite place. Elena explained her mother's condition with the clinical detachment she had learned from watching too many doctor consultations, describing the genetic blood disorder that attacked her immune system while remaining mysteriously resistant to every treatment conventional medicine could offer. She cited the forbidden texts she had discovered, the historical accounts of vampire blood's healing properties, the desperate calculations that had led her to break into his fortress rather than watch her mother fade away in a sterile hospital room. Aldrich's hand moved toward his wrist with the decisive motion of someone granting a request, and Elena felt hope bloom in her chest like a physical warmth. But then his fingers stopped as his gaze fell on additional papers tucked behind her mother's chart. The DNA test results seemed to glow in the lamplight as he pulled them free, his ancient eyes scanning the genetic markers that Elena still didn't fully understand, but knew represented something impossible, something that would change everything if he recognized what the numbers meant. The numbers on the DNA test results burned into Aldrich's vision like brands against his ancient retinas, the 99.7% paternity match striking him with the force of a stake through whatever remained of his heart. His fingers trembled against the paper, a reaction he hadn't experienced in 3 centuries of existence, as the impossible truth rewrote everything he believed about loss and love, and the cruel mathematics of fate. Elena watched his face transform from curiosity to shock to something approaching devastation. Though she couldn't understand why genetic proof would affect a stranger so profoundly, until he whispered her mother's name like a prayer torn from unwilling lips. The study fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock that had measured decades, while Aldrich mourned a woman he thought was dead, counted years while Elena grew up fatherless and alone, marked time while Sarah Thorne suffered in exile from the only man she had ever loved. Aldrich rose from his chair with movements that seemed to cost him tremendous effort, crossing to an ornate cabinet that stood against the far wall like a shrine to memories he had tried to bury beneath centuries of duty and isolation. His hands shook as he opened a drawer and withdrew a silver locket, its surface worn smooth by decades of desperate touching, and placed it on the desk between them with the reverence reserved for sacred relics. Elena stared at the photograph inside and saw her own face looking back from 30 years in the past. Her mother's, features so identical to her own that they could have been twins separated by time rather than generation. The woman in the picture smiled with joy that Elena had never seen on her mother's face. Radiant happiness that spoke of love so complete it transformed everything it touched, and Elena realized she was looking at the moment before her world had been broken beyond repair. Aldrich's voice cracked as he told her about 1995, the year that had defined both their destinies, when Sarah Martinez had been a young medical researcher working on cutting-edge studies of blood-borne diseases and their potential treatments. She had been brilliant, ambitious, and fearless in ways that attracted attention from both conventional medical establishments and more shadowy organizations interested in her work's supernatural implications. Aldrich had first encountered her in a university laboratory where she was analyzing blood samples that shouldn't have existed, specimens provided by black market dealers who claimed they came from creatures that medical science insisted were mythology. Sarah's research had stumbled onto vampire physiology through academic accident, but her pursuit of understanding became deliberate obsession once she realized the healing properties contained in supernatural blood could revolutionize medicine for humanity. Their first meeting had been a confrontation where Aldrich intended to destroy her research and perhaps eliminate a threat to vampire secrecy, but Sarah's fearless curiosity and genuine desire to help suffering patients had penetrated defenses he had maintained for centuries. She hadn't been afraid when he revealed his true nature, hadn't recoiled from fangs or supernatural speed, had instead peppered him with questions about his physiology and metabolism like he was a fascinating research subject rather than a predator. Their professional collaboration had become personal attraction with dangerous speed, two brilliant minds finding intellectual partnership that deepened into emotional connection neither had expected or prepared for. Sarah's laboratory had become their secret meeting place, where she would draw blood samples while they debated philosophy and science, where academic discussions about vampire biology had transformed into intimate conversations about immortality and love, and whether creatures like Aldrich could find redemption through connection with humans like Sarah. Their relationship had violated every vampire law about maintaining separation between species, had risked not just their lives, but the entire careful balance that kept vampire society hidden from human detection. But neither could resist the pull of finding someone who understood both their intellectual passions and their deepest fears. Sarah had become pregnant during a time when vampire politics were particularly volatile, when rival factions were seeking any excuse to challenge Aldrich's leadership and expose weakness they could exploit for their own advancement. The pregnancy had been impossible according to everything vampires believed about their own biology, but Sarah's research had revealed genetic compatibility that shouldn't have existed, potential for hybrid offspring that terrified vampire traditionalists who viewed human contamination as existential threat. Aldrich had been planning to formally claim Sarah and their unborn child, to challenge vampire law and risk everything for the family he never thought he could have, when the car accident had stolen his future in a single devastating moment. The official reports had described brake failure on a mountain road, a tragic accident that claimed both Sarah and their unborn daughter, but Aldrich had always suspected assassination disguised as mechanical failure. He had mourned them for 30 years, carrying guilt that his love had condemned them to death, believing himself responsible for destroying the only pure happiness he had ever known through selfish desire for connection he should never have pursued. The locket had been his only remaining connection to Sarah, the photograph taken during their final week together when she had been glowing with pregnancy and plans for their impossible future. When they had believed love could overcome the ancient hatreds that divided their species. Elena listened to his story with growing understanding of the mysteries that had shaped her childhood, the questions her mother had never answered, and the fears that had driven them from city to city whenever Sarah sensed they were being watched. She told Aldrich about growing up believing her father had abandoned them, raised by a woman who worked 3 jobs to keep them hidden and safe, who suffered from mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't diagnose or treat effectively. Sarah had never spoken about Elena's father, except to say he was dangerous, and that revealing his identity would put them all at risk, creating mythology around absence that left Elena feeling incomplete and unwanted. The moves had always come suddenly, triggered by Sarah's paranoid detection of surveillance or threats that Elena couldn't see, uprooting their lives whenever her mother detected patterns that suggested they had been discovered. Sarah's recurring illnesses had grown worse over the years, mysterious symptoms that appeared and disappeared without medical explanation, weakness and pain that conventional medicine attributed to stress and overwork but never successfully treated. Elena had spent her teenage years watching her mother fade slowly, accepting extra shifts at multiple jobs to pay for medical consultations that offered no solutions. Seeing Sarah's beautiful face grow gaunt with suffering, she wouldn't explain or allow anyone to help her bear. The irony of Sarah's condition became clear as Aldrich explained vampire venom's delayed effects on human physiology, the way intimate contact with vampire biology created long-term complications that could remain dormant for decades before manifesting as the autoimmune cascade that was now killing her. Sarah's body had been fighting vampire venom for 30 years, her immune system gradually losing a war against foreign elements that had been introduced through love rather than violence, through tender kisses and gentle touches that had carried consequences neither of them understood at the time. Elena's mixed heritage had protected her from the same fate, her hybrid genetics creating immunity to the venom that was destroying her mother, but it also meant she would inherit supernatural longevity that would outlast every human connection she might form in the centuries ahead. Aldrich studied Elena's face with new recognition, seeing Sarah's features, but also his own ancient bloodline reflected in bone structure and eye color, genetic legacy that proved their love had created something unprecedented in vampire history. Elena was living proof that the barriers between species were artificial constructs rather than biological impossibilities, evidence that vampire and human genetics could combine to create something stronger than either alone. The revelation transformed her midnight infiltration from desperate charity request into family reunion, changed her status from intruder to rightful heir, but also exposed her to dangers that had driven her mother into 30 years of exile and fear. Aldrich realized that Sarah's supposed death had been carefully orchestrated protection, rather than tragic accident, her decision to disappear with their unborn child, rather than risk exposure to vampire politics that would have used Elena as weapon, or destroyed her as abomination. Sarah had sacrificed everything for their daughter's safety, had chosen exile and poverty and slow death from vampire venom rather than allow their child to become pawn in supernatural conflicts that predated human civilization. The weight of 30 years' separation pressed against them both. Decades of missed birthdays and bedtime stories and father-daughter moments that could never be recovered, time stolen by fear and politics, and the cruel necessity of protection that required abandoning everything they might have shared. Elena stared at her father's face and saw her own features reflected in someone who had mourned her death for 30 years, who had carried guilt for her supposed destruction while she grew up, believing herself unwanted and abandoned by a man who would have moved heaven and earth to keep her safe. The DNA test results lay between them like a bridge across 3 decades of separation, scientific proof of connection that transcended the laws and fears that had kept them apart, evidence that love could survive even the most impossible circumstances if it was strong enough and patient enough to endure whatever forces tried to destroy it. Aldrich moved to the window overlooking his domain, his reflection ghost-like against the glass as he explained the intricate web of laws and politics that had governed vampire society for over 2 millennia. The Vampire Council operated under codes written in blood and sealed with oaths that bound every supernatural creature within their jurisdiction, ancient statutes that viewed mixing bloodlines as the ultimate heresy, punishable by immediate execution for all parties involved. Elena listened with growing horror as her father described a world where love was treason and family ties were death sentences, where the mere existence of hybrid offspring like herself represented such fundamental threat to vampire purity that entire bloodlines had been exterminated to prevent contamination from spreading through their ranks. The council consisted of 7 houses, each representing different vampire lineages that traced their origins back to the founding knights of their species, and every decision required unanimous consent from lords who had spent centuries cultivating hatred for each other alongside their mutual disdain for humanity. Lord Marcus Vex led the largest and most traditional house, vampires who viewed themselves as apex predators destined to rule over lesser species, who considered Aldrich's relatively progressive policies regarding human interaction to be dangerous weakness that undermined everything their kind represented. Marcus had been seeking opportunities to challenge Aldrich's leadership for over 3 centuries, accumulating political support among vampires who preferred the old ways of hunting and domination to the careful coexistence that Aldrich had negotiated through decades of diplomatic maneuvering. The peace treaty that maintained stability between vampire houses was built on delicate balance of power and mutual assured destruction, agreements forged through centuries of warfare that had nearly driven their species to extinction through internal conflict. Any scandal that exposed weakness in Aldrich's position would provide Marcus with the excuse he needed to declare the current leadership invalid and plunge vampire society back into the chaos of open warfare between rival factions seeking dominance. Elena represented the ultimate scandal, living proof that Aldrich had violated the most fundamental law of vampire society, evidence that could justify not just his removal from power, but his complete destruction, along with everyone connected to his bloodline. Aldrich's blood could indeed save Sarah's life, but the healing process would create supernatural connections that enhanced vampires could detect across vast distances, marking both mother and daughter with psychic signatures that would announce their hybrid nature to every supernatural creature with sufficient sensitivity to recognize the anomaly. The vampire world operated through networks of spies and informants who reported directly to the council, creatures whose enhanced senses could identify mixed bloodlines through scent markers and energy patterns that hybrids couldn't suppress or disguise. Healing Sarah would be Sarah, equivalent to sending announcement letters to every vampire house simultaneously, declaring Aldrich's crimes against species purity while providing his enemies with the evidence they needed to justify his execution. Elena felt the weight of impossible choices pressing against her chest like physical force, understanding that saving her mother might doom them all, but unable to accept watching Sarah die when salvation existed within reach. She challenged Aldrich's calculations with fury that surprised them both, demanding to know when political considerations had become more important than family bonds, when preserving power had taken precedence over protecting the people he claimed to love. Aldrich's composure cracked as she accused him of abandoning them twice. First through Sarah's forced exile, and now through refusing to risk his position to save her life. Choosing vampire law over human connection, just as the council expected him to do. Her words struck him like physical blows because they contained truth he had been trying to avoid acknowledging. The reality that his kingship had always required sacrificing personal happiness for the greater stability of vampire society. Elena's mixed heritage made her immune to the political calculations that constrained pure vampires, allowed her to see clearly through the maze of ancient obligations that had trapped Aldrich in patterns of behavior designed to maintain peace at the cost of individual fulfillment. She pointed out that his enemies would eventually find other excuses to challenge his rule regardless of whether he helped Sarah, that living in fear of discovery was just another form of death sentence that served their rival's interests by keeping him paralyzed and reactive. Aldrich led her through hidden passages behind the study walls, down stone stairs that descended into chambers older than any surface architecture, spaces carved from living rock during the earliest days of vampire civilization when their laws were written in blood rather than parchment. The secret chamber, he revealed, contained dozens of portraits spanning centuries, beautiful faces frozen in oils and watercolors that depicted vampire nobility who had been executed for the crime of loving beyond their species' boundaries. Elena stared at the gallery of the condemned and saw her own possible future reflected in their painted eyes. Generations of vampires who had chosen love over law and paid the ultimate price for their defiance of council authority. Each portrait bore a small plaque detailing the circumstances of death, stories of lovers tortured and children murdered, and entire bloodlines exterminated to prevent contamination from spreading through vampire society like a plague that threatened their fundamental nature. The chamber served as both memorial and warning, tribute to those who had died for love, while simultaneously reminding viewers of the consequences that awaited anyone foolish enough to follow their example. Aldrich showed her portraits of his own ancestors, who had been executed for various crimes against vampire purity. Relatives he had never met because their names had been erased from official histories along with their lives. The council's justice was absolute and retroactive, extending punishment not just to immediate offenders, but to their entire genetic lines, ensuring that rebellious bloodlines were completely eliminated, rather than allowed to pass their defiance to future generations. Elena studied the faces of the condemned and felt something stirring within her consciousness, a strange resonance that seemed to connect her to the painted figures through bonds deeper than mere visual recognition. The portraits began to shimmer with otherworldly energy as her hybrid nature responded to the psychic imprints left by centuries of anguish and defiance, allowing her to sense the emotions and memories that lingered in the chamber like ghosts demanding justice. She could feel their anger and determination bleeding through the barriers between life and death, spirits who refused to accept that love was weakness or that species boundaries justified genocide against those who dared to cross them. The chamber itself seemed to pulse with accumulated power from all the forbidden relationships it commemorated, supernatural energy that recognized Elena as kindred spirit and heir to their interrupted legacy. Aldrich watched in amazement as Elena's eyes began to glow with silver light that reflected her mixed heritage, vampire abilities awakening under the influence of ancestral spirits who had died defending the same principles she now embodied. Her hybrid genetics gave her access to vampire powers without the traditional limitations that bound pure-blooded members of their species, allowing her to compel truth from other vampires and sense their deepest emotions without triggering the defensive mechanisms that normally protected vampire minds from intrusion. Elena turned this newfound ability on Aldrich himself, silver light intensifying as she reached into his consciousness and demanded answers to questions he had been avoiding since the moment he recognized her as his daughter. The compulsion bypassed his ancient mental defenses like they were cobwebs, forcing him to confront truths he had buried beneath centuries of duty and political necessity, memories he had tried to forget in order to function as the leader vampire society demanded. Under her influence, he admitted that he had been searching for them both for 30 years, had never truly believed the reports of their deaths despite official evidence, had maintained networks of human informants specifically tasked with investigating any traces of Sarah or their child. He confessed to hiring private investigators and bribing medical records clerks, and following every rumor that suggested his family might have survived the supposed accident, hope driving him to continue seeking what logic insisted was impossible. Elena felt his anguish through their psychic connection, 3 decades of guilt and desperate longing that had shaped every decision he made as Vampire King, loss that had motivated his progressive policies toward humans because he couldn't bear the thought of other families suffering separation like his own. His search had always been conducted in absolute secrecy because admitting he believed they were alive would have exposed them to the very dangers Sarah had tried to escape. But the constant uncertainty had eaten away at his soul, like acid consuming everything pure and hopeful within his immortal existence. The compulsion revealed that Aldrich had been preparing for this reunion since the day he lost them, accumulating power and resources and political alliances that might someday protect Elena if she ever returned to claim her birthright as his heir. Every decision he made as Vampire King was influenced by consideration of how it might affect his daughter's future safety. Political maneuvering designed to gradually shift vampire society toward positions that might eventually accept hybrid existence without immediate execution. Elena saw through his memories that he had been working to change vampire law from within, supporting younger council members who questioned traditional policies, laying groundwork for cultural evolution that might take centuries to achieve, but could eventually create space for creatures like herself to exist openly. The revelation that her existence had been the secret motivation behind decades of vampire political reform struck Elena with force that left her breathless. Understanding that her father had been fighting for her future since before she was old enough to know she needed protection. His refusal to heal Sarah wasn't cowardice, but calculation based on 30 years of careful preparation, fear that moving too quickly would destroy everything he had built toward the moment when his family could finally be reunited safely. Elena felt the weight of his love through their psychic connection, devotion so complete it had shaped the destiny of an entire species, and realized that saving her mother would require not just vampire blood, but revolution against laws that had governed supernatural society since its inception. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Elena led Aldrich through empty hospital corridors that smelled of disinfectant and dying dreams. her footsteps echoing against polished floors as they navigated toward the oncology ward, where Sarah Thorne lay connected to machines that measured the steady decline of a woman who had sacrificed everything for love and duty. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows that made Aldrich appear more ghostly than usual, his supernatural nature seeming oddly diminished in this sterile environment, dedicated to fighting death through science rather than accepting it through ancient resignation. Elena had called ahead using a payphone outside Aldrich's fortress, speaking in coded language to the night nurse who had grown accustomed to her irregular visiting hours over the past 3 weeks, explaining that she was bringing someone important who needed to see her mother before morning rounds began. The hospital felt different with Aldrich beside her, charged with tension that made electronic equipment flicker and caused security cameras to develop mysterious blind spots wherever his presence lingered too long in their mechanical gaze. Elena pushed open the door to room 314 and watched her mother's face transform from peaceful sleep to wide-eyed shock as Aldrich stepped into the circle of lamplight surrounding her bed. 30 years of separation collapsing into a single moment of recognition that rewrote both their expressions with joy and terror intermingled. Sarah struggled to sit up, despite the IV lines tethering her to life support systems. Her voice barely a whisper as she spoke his name, like an incantation that might make him disappear if pronounced incorrectly, her eyes drinking in every detail of his unchanged face, while her own showed the ravages of 3 decades spent aging alone. Aldrich approached her bed with movements that suggested he was walking through a minefield, each step calculated to avoid triggering whatever fragile equilibrium kept Sarah alive long enough for this impossible reunion to occur in sterile safety rather than supernatural chaos. Elena watched her parents rediscover each other across the vast distance created by forced separation and voluntary exile, seeing love that had survived everything vampire politics and human fear could inflict upon two hearts that refused to accept defeat. Sarah's shock at seeing Aldrich revealed layers of deception Elena had never suspected, protective lies that extended far beyond simple identity concealment into realms of scientific research and genetic manipulation that had consumed 30 years of secretive work. She explained in halting whispers that she had faked her death when vampire spies discovered the Council's plan to kidnap their unborn child, intelligence gathered through network contacts who had warned her that Elena was destined to become weapon, rather than daughter, in vampire political warfare. The car accident had been carefully staged, theater designed to convince vampire surveillance that both mother and child had perished. Elaborate deception that required Sarah to abandon her identity and research position while pregnant and terrified, starting over in a new city with forged documents and determination to protect her daughter from supernatural forces beyond human comprehension. Sarah had spent the following decades developing understanding of vampire biology that surpassed anything in their own ancient libraries, using Elena's unique genetic profile to create treatments and cures that could revolutionize supernatural medicine while simultaneously representing existential threat to traditional vampire society. She had been working on cure for vampire blood addiction, the fundamental compulsion that drove their species to hunt and feed on human victims. Research that could potentially free vampires from their predatory nature while making them vulnerable to enemies who thrived on the current system of supernatural supremacy. Elena's hybrid genetics provided the key to understanding how vampire and human biology could coexist without the traditional master-slave relationship that defined their species' interactions, genetic markers that suggested evolution toward something beyond the limitations that had trapped both races in cycles of violence and fear. Sarah had been using blood samples taken during Elena's childhood medical checkups, analyzing cellular structures and immune responses that revealed how hybrid physiology could resist vampire venom while processing supernatural elements in ways that enhanced rather than corrupted human biological functions. The research had taken decades because Sarah worked in isolation, unable to access proper laboratory facilities or collaborate with colleagues who might understand the implications of her discoveries, forced to conduct experiments in basement workshops and abandoned buildings while maintaining day jobs that provided minimal income for herself and Elena. Her recurring illnesses weren't just delayed reactions to vampire venom, but direct consequences of self-experimentation, decades of testing potential cures on her own infected bloodstream in desperate attempts to perfect treatments that might someday protect other humans from suffering similar contamination. Sarah had been slowly poisoning herself with modified vampire toxins while seeking antidotes that could neutralize supernatural influences without killing the host. Research that required her to understand exactly how vampire biology affected human physiology through personal experience of every symptom and side effect. She had documented everything in journals hidden throughout various safety deposit boxes and storage units, research notes that represented 30 years of sacrificial science conducted in service of creating better future for both species, regardless of the personal cost. Elena stared at her mother with new understanding of the strength required to maintain such elaborate deception while raising a child alone, protecting her daughter's innocence while simultaneously preparing weapons that could either save or destroy entire supernatural community. Sarah revealed that her illness had accelerated recently because she had finally achieved breakthrough in her research, discovering combination of Elena's genetic material and synthetic compounds that could neutralize vampire bloodlust without destroying supernatural abilities. Cure that would allow vampires to retain their enhanced strength and longevity, while eliminating their compulsive need to feed on human blood. The successful formula had required testing on increasingly concentrated doses of vampire venom, experiments that had pushed Sarah's compromised immune system beyond its capacity to recover, trading her own life for research that could prevent countless future deaths from vampire attacks. Elena realized her mother was dying not from unavoidable disease, but from heroic self-sacrifice, scientific martyrdom that had produced solutions to problems plaguing both species, while simultaneously creating weapons that could be used to commit genocide against vampires if the research fell into wrong hands. The hospital room fell silent, except for mechanical breathing of life support equipment, as father and daughter absorbed the magnitude of Sarah's hidden work. Understanding that she had been fighting vampire oppression through scientific resistance, while they believed she was simply trying to survive in exile. Aldrich reached for Sarah's hand with trembling fingers that revealed how deeply her revelations had shaken his ancient composure. Vampire King confronting evidence that human determination could surpass supernatural power through pure intellectual commitment to justice. Elena felt pride and terror warring in her chest as she realized her mother had been secret warrior in conflicts she never knew existed. Scientist whose research could fundamentally alter balance of power between species, regardless of whether vampire politics was ready for such dramatic change. The moment of reunion was shattered by sound of elevator doors opening in corridor outside, footsteps that moved with supernatural silence but carried weight that made hospital walls vibrate with barely contained predatory energy. Lord Marcus Vex entered the room, followed by 6 enforcers, whose presence made electronic equipment throughout oncology ward malfunction simultaneously. Vampire Lord, whose perfect features masked centuries of accumulated cruelty and political ambition that had been focused entirely on destroying Aldrich's progressive leadership. Marcus smiled with satisfaction that revealed fangs designed for intimidation rather than feeding, his voice carrying authority that made hospital staff throughout building suddenly develop urgent reasons to avoid third floor entirely, despite having no conscious awareness of supernatural threat gathering in room 314. He congratulated Aldrich on finally locating his lost family, while simultaneously revealing that vampire intelligence networks had been monitoring Elena since childhood, gathering information about her hybrid abilities and her mother's research through surveillance so sophisticated it made human government spying look primitive by comparison. Marcus explained that he had known about Elena's existence for years, but had waited for optimal moment to use her against Aldrich, allowing the vampire king to become emotionally invested in reunion before revealing that both daughter and former lover were already forfeit to vampire justice. Sarah's research represented exactly the sort of innovation that traditional vampire society viewed as existential threat, scientific advancement that could undermine fundamental assumptions about species hierarchy, while providing humans with weapons capable of destroying vampire civilization through biological warfare. Elena's hybrid nature made her simultaneously the most valuable and dangerous creature in supernatural world, genetic anomaly whose abilities could either bridge differences between species or serve as ultimate weapon for whichever side gained control of her unique biology. Marcus demanded Aldrich's immediate abdication in exchange for allowing Elena and Sarah to live under council supervision, political compromise that would install traditionalist leadership while preserving hybrid research under vampire control, rather than allowing it to spread through human scientific communities. The hospital corridors filled with additional vampire enforcers who moved through building like shadows made solid, supernatural creatures whose presence created electromagnetic disturbances that shut down security systems while medical staff found themselves inexplicably compelled to take extended breaks that left entire sections of hospital mysteriously empty. Elena realized they were trapped by forces that could tear through human military resistance without effort. Vampire politics played with life and death stakes that made hospital settings seem absurdly fragile backdrop for supernatural power struggles that would determine fate of two entire species. Marcus revealed that vampire surveillance had been documenting Sarah's research for decades, waiting for her to complete work that could then be confiscated and weaponized according to council priorities, rather than humanitarian goals she had pursued through decades of painful sacrifice. The serum Sarah had developed could either cure vampire bloodlust, as she intended, or be modified to create biological weapon capable of destroying all vampires simultaneously, making control of her research equivalent to possessing nuclear weapons in conflicts between supernatural and human civilizations. Elena felt crushing weight of responsibility as she understood that her existence had been catalyst for discoveries that could either unite species in peaceful coexistence or provide tools for mutual annihilation, depending on whose hands controlled implementation of her mother's scientific breakthroughs. The hospital room became center of political crisis that would reshape supernatural world, regardless of outcome. 3 generations of family torn between love and duty, while vampire enforcers prepared to collect genetic materials and research data that represented power beyond anything Council had previously possessed. Aldrich's mental call resonated through supernatural frequencies that penetrated walls and distance, reaching ancient allies who had sworn blood oaths to answer his summons, regardless of personal cost or political consequence. Lady Isabel Noir received his desperate message while presiding over her own court 3 cities away, her porcelain features hardening into mask of deadly determination as she understood that the Vampire King's family had finally been discovered and threatened by forces that would show no mercy to hybrid bloodlines. Within minutes, she had mobilized her most trusted followers, vampires who shared Aldrich's vision of peaceful coexistence between species rather than eternal dominance through fear and predation. Supernatural creatures who risked their own existence by supporting progressive politics that traditional council members viewed as heretical weakness. Isabel's network included vampires from every major house who had grown tired of centuries spent hiding in shadows and feeding on terror, ancient beings who remembered what it felt like to love humans rather than simply hunting them, creatures who believed their species could evolve beyond predatory limitations if given proper leadership and inspiration. They moved through night like coordinated strike force, using supernatural speed and shadow manipulation to infiltrate hospital through methods that bypassed human security while remaining invisible to vampire surveillance systems Marcus had established around building perimeter. Elena felt their approach before seeing them, her hybrid senses detecting supernatural signatures that registered as friendly rather than threatening, psychic resonance that identified them as potential allies, rather than additional enemies in political conflict that seemed to escalate beyond control with every passing minute. The first sign of their arrival was subtle shift in hospital atmosphere as electronic systems began functioning normally again. Marcus's enforcers finding their technological disruption abilities neutralized by countermeasures deployed by vampires who understood how to manipulate electromagnetic fields without destroying delicate medical equipment, keeping patients alive throughout building. Isabel herself materialized in Sarah's hospital room through shadows that seemed to bend reality around her elegant form. Ancient vampire whose beauty had remained unchanged since medieval times when she had been Aldrich's closest advisor and most trusted friend. Her presence brought immediate relief to Elena, who recognized instinctively that this supernatural creature posed no threat to her family, despite fangs and predatory grace that marked her as apex predator, capable of devastating violence if circumstances demanded such extreme measures. Isabel assessed situation with tactical precision born from centuries of supernatural conflict. Her pale eyes cataloging threats and advantages, while her mind calculated strategies that could extract Aldrich's family from Marcus's trap without triggering wider vampire war that would expose their species to human detection. She explained in whispers that carried clearly despite medical equipment noise that her network had been preparing for this confrontation, since reports first surfaced about hybrid child whose existence violated fundamental vampire law. Understanding that Elena's discovery would inevitably lead to political crisis requiring military response from progressive factions. Elena discovered her hybrid heritage granted her unprecedented control over vampire minds as stress triggered abilities she hadn't known she possessed. Silver light emanating from her eyes as she reached into consciousness of Marcus's nearest enforcer and commanded him to step away from her mother's bedside. The vampire obeyed without resistance, his ancient will completely overridden by compulsion that bypassed traditional mental defenses through genetic authority that pure vampires couldn't comprehend or resist effectively. Elena's power felt like electric current flowing through her nervous system, intoxicating rush of absolute control that allowed her to bend supernatural creatures to her desires simply by focusing intention and allowing hybrid genetics to assert dominance over lesser bloodlines. The sensation was addictive in ways that terrified her, offering glimpse of godlike authority over beings who had ruled humanity through fear for millennia. But using these abilities created psychic disturbances that rippled through supernatural realm like beacon attracting attention from entities far more dangerous than vampire political factions. Ancient things stirred in response to Elena's power display. Primordial creatures who existed beyond vampire hierarchy and viewed hybrid genetics as either ultimate threat to supernatural order or opportunity to reclaim dominance they had lost when younger species rose to prominence. Elena felt their attention like weight pressing against her consciousness. Alien intelligence evaluating whether she represented evolution or abomination that needed immediate elimination. Scrutiny from beings whose existence predated human civilization and vampire society by geological ages. Sarah struggled against medical restraints as she revealed crucial information about research location, speaking through pain and medication to explain that her complete work was stored in safety deposit box at First National Bank, vault secured by biometric locks that required Elena's genetic signature to access contents that could reshape supernatural world. The research included not just cure for vampire bloodlust, but method for completely reversing vampire transformation, scientific process that could restore full humanity to creatures who had been changed against their will or who desired freedom from supernatural existence that had become burden rather than blessing. This information represented ultimate weapon against vampire society, knowledge that could theoretically eliminate their entire species through voluntary transformation back to human mortality. But it also offered hope for vampires who had grown weary of eternal existence spent consuming others to maintain their own immortal lives. Sarah explained that reversing vampire transformation required combination of Elena's unique genetic material and specific sequence of treatments that would gradually restore human physiology while preserving memories and personality that made individual vampires who they were beneath supernatural modifications. The process would be irreversible once initiated, permanent choice between supernatural power and human mortality that each vampire would have to make individually, rather than having imposed upon them by external forces seeking to commit genocide through forced medical intervention. Elena realized her mother had been developing tools for species liberation rather than destruction, research designed to offer choices rather than eliminate options, scientific advancement that respected individual autonomy while addressing systemic problems created by vampire dependence on human victimization. The revelation transformed understanding of what was at stake in current confrontation, making clear that battle wasn't simply about Elena's survival, but about future of supernatural evolution and possibility that ancient conflicts could be resolved through scientific innovation rather than continued warfare. Isabel's reinforcements took positions throughout hospital while maintaining careful balance between protecting Elena's family and avoiding actions that would justify Marcus's claims about progressive vampire factions representing existential threat to traditional society. The building became chessboard where supernatural powers maneuvered for advantage, while human patients and staff remained obliviously unaware that their medical facility had become center of conflict that would determine whether vampire civilization evolved toward coexistence or devolved into genocidal war against human populations. Elena felt mounting pressure from multiple sources as her hybrid nature attracted attention from ancient entities, while simultaneously making her target for vampire factions seeking to control or eliminate hybrid genetics that challenged fundamental assumptions about species hierarchy and supernatural superiority. Marcus revealed his true intentions as political maneuvering gave way to direct confrontation, explaining that he had never intended to simply execute Elena for violating vampire law, but instead planned to use her unique genetics to create an army of controllable half-vampires who would combine human adaptability with vampire strength under council direction. Elena's reproductive potential represented opportunity to breed new species that could serve traditional vampire interests while appearing to embrace progressive ideals about human-vampire cooperation, genetic slavery disguised as evolutionary, advancement that would preserve power structures while eliminating inconvenient resistance from both human and vampire populations who opposed council authority. Aldrich realized with horror that Marcus had orchestrated Sarah's original accident specifically to separate their family while keeping Elena alive for future exploitation, decades-long conspiracy that had used their love as weapon against them while positioning Marcus to benefit from research Sarah developed during 30 years of exile and desperate scientific work. The supposed car accident had been carefully planned assassination attempt designed to kill Sarah while capturing Elena for council experimentation. Plot that failed only because Sarah's intelligence network had discovered vampire surveillance in time to stage convincing death scene that protected their unborn daughter from immediate capture. Marcus had spent intervening years searching for Elena while simultaneously funding research into hybrid genetics through human scientific institutions, using vampire resources to advance understanding of supernatural biology while preparing infrastructure needed to exploit Elena's unique properties once she was finally located and captured. The hospital transformed into battlefield as vampire factions abandoned diplomatic pretense in favor of direct supernatural warfare, ancient creatures wielding powers that made human weapons seem primitive while fighting for control of research and genetic materials that could reshape civilization, according to whoever emerged victorious from conflict. Elena faced impossible choice between using her dangerous abilities to protect everyone she loved or preserving humanity that made her more than just another supernatural weapon in political struggle between species that viewed her existence as either salvation or abomination, requiring immediate elimination. Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly as stress triggered final cascade of immune system failure, her body finally succumbing to decades of self-experimentation and vampire venom exposure while surrounded by supernatural conflict that represented culmination of everything she had worked to prevent through scientific dedication and personal sacrifice. Aldrich's voice carried weight of centuries as he explained the ancient binding ritual that could save Sarah's life, while simultaneously making Elena his acknowledged heir in eyes of supernatural law, permanent blood bond that would grant them unprecedented power at cost of making them eternal targets for vampire traditionalists who viewed such ceremonies as ultimate blasphemy. The ritual predated modern vampire politics by millennia, originating during earliest nights of their species when blood bonds created unbreakable connections between vampires and their chosen successors. Magical ceremonies that transferred not just power, but memories and abilities across generations, through shared essence that became part of each participant's fundamental nature. Elena listened with growing understanding that accepting this proposal meant abandoning any hope of normal human existence, embracing supernatural heritage that would mark her as hybrid royalty while painting target on her back that would never fade regardless of political changes or cultural evolution within vampire society. Isabel explained in hushed tones that binding ritual hadn't been performed in over 1,000 years because previous attempts had either granted participants godlike abilities that threatened established order, or killed everyone involved through magical feedback that human physiology couldn't survive, making Elena's mixed genetics crucial variable that might allow ceremony to succeed where pure vampire bloodlines had failed catastrophically. The ritual required three-way blood exchange conducted under specific supernatural conditions that would create permanent psychic connection between Elena, Aldrich, and Sarah, sharing memories and abilities while binding their life forces together in ways that made them stronger collectively than any individual vampire could become through traditional means. Elena would need to drink Aldrich's blood while simultaneously feeding her own essence to Sarah, creating circular flow of supernatural energy that would heal her mother's vampire venom poisoning while awakening hybrid abilities that could either save them all or destroy hospital, along with everyone trapped inside building. Sarah's condition continued deteriorating as medical equipment registered system failures cascading through her immune system, decades of self-experimentation finally overwhelming her body's capacity to maintain basic functions, while supernatural conflict raged around her bed like storm threatening to tear reality apart. Aldrich prepared ritual implements that Isabel had brought from his fortress, ancient silver chalice and ceremonial blade that had been used for blood magic during earliest days of vampire civilization, artifacts whose very presence made air in hospital rooms shimmer with otherworldly energy that caused electronic equipment to malfunction in increasingly dramatic ways. Elena felt terror and determination warring in her chest as she realized this ceremony would either grant her power to protect everyone she loved or transform her into something so fundamentally different from humanity that she would lose herself in process of trying to save others. Marcus's enforcers pressed closer as Isabel's network fought supernatural battle throughout hospital corridors, vampire factions clashing with abilities that made walls crack and lights explode, while human staff remained mysteriously compelled to avoid areas where ancient creatures settled political disputes through violence that predated civilization. The binding ritual could only be performed in consecrated space, where supernatural energies would be contained rather than spreading chaotically through building, leading them to hospital chapel, where stained glass windows and religious symbols provided mystical framework necessary for ceremony that required divine blessing alongside vampiric power. Elena helped transfer Sarah to wheelchair while medical monitors screamed warnings about her plummeting vital signs, racing against time as her mother's body surrendered to poison that had been killing her slowly for 30 years, but was now accelerating toward final system shutdown. The chapel felt charged with spiritual energy that seemed to recognize supernatural presences entering sacred space, candlelight flickering in response to vampire auras, while religious artwork appeared to watch proceedings with painted eyes that reflected otherworldly awareness. Aldrich began ritual preparations with movements that suggested muscle memory from ceremonies performed centuries ago. His hands steady, despite magnitude of what they were attempting as he arranged chalice and blade according to patterns that predated written history. Elena knelt beside her mother's wheelchair, while Sarah struggled to remain conscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, as vampire venom triggered final immune cascade that would claim her life within hours if supernatural intervention didn't succeed in reversing decades of accumulated damage. Isabel stood guard at chapel entrance while coordinating defensive positions throughout hospital, her network of progressive vampires holding strategic locations against Marcus's traditionalist forces who were methodically advancing through building toward ultimate confrontation that would determine future of vampire civilization. The ritual chalice gleamed in candlelight as Aldrich made precise cut across his wrist. Ancient blood flowing like liquid starlight into silver vessel that seemed to absorb supernatural essence while amplifying its potency through magical properties embedded in metal during creation ceremonies lost to history. Elena watched crimson streams swirl in chalice and felt her hybrid genetics responding to proximity of vampire blood, cellular structures that had remained dormant throughout her human childhood awakening in preparation for transformation that would either elevate her to supernatural royalty or destroy her through magical overload. Sarah managed whispered words of love and encouragement as Elena lifted ceremonial blade to make corresponding cut in her own wrist, understanding that this moment would define rest of their lives while hoping that love could overcome ancient magic designed for pure vampire bloodlines rather than hybrid genetics. Elena's blood mixed with Aldrich's in chalice, while supernatural energy began building around them, like gathering storm, silver light emanating from their combined essence as ritual activated dormant powers that had been waiting generations for proper catalyst to unlock abilities beyond anything traditional vampire society had ever encountered. The three-way blood bond required Sarah to drink from chalice, while Elena consumed mixture directly from Aldrich's wrist, creating circular flow of supernatural energy that would either heal Sarah's poisoning or overwhelm her human physiology with vampiric power too concentrated for mortal frame to contain safely. Elena felt electricity coursing through her nervous system as Aldrich's ancient memories flooded into her consciousness. Centuries of knowledge and experience transferred through blood magic, while her own hybrid nature added unprecedented elements to ritual that had never been attempted with mixed genetics. Sarah's transformation began immediately, as vampire blood neutralized poison that had been destroying her immune system. But healing process also awakened psychic connections that allowed her to access Aldrich's memories, spanning multiple centuries, knowledge that included location of ancient artifacts capable of shifting balance of power between supernatural factions. Elena's abilities exploded beyond anything she had previously imagined as hybrid genetics combined with ritual magic to grant her control over vampire minds that extended far beyond simple compulsion. Authority that could command entire bloodlines while simultaneously accessing primordial forces that predated vampire civilization. The chapel filled with silver radiance as Elena's transformation reached crescendo, her consciousness expanding to encompass supernatural frequencies that allowed her to sense every vampire within miles, while commanding absolute obedience from creatures who had never acknowledged authority beyond council leadership. Marcus burst into chapel followed by council members who had arrived to witness Aldrich's supposed treason, but found instead hybrid princess, whose newfound powers made their ancient authority seem insignificant by comparison. Young woman whose mixed heritage had been amplified by blood ritual into something beyond traditional supernatural categories. Elena rose from kneeling position with movements that radiated power even Marcus couldn't ignore, her silver eyes reflecting depths that suggested consciousness spanning multiple dimensions. while her voice carried harmonics that resonated in vampire souls like divine commandment that couldn't be disobeyed or questioned. Sarah stood beside her daughter with strength restored through supernatural healing, but her human appearance concealed access to Aldrich's millennia of memories, including knowledge of artifacts hidden throughout world that could either unite supernatural species in cooperation or provide weapons capable of destroying vampire civilization entirely. The binding ritual had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, while simultaneously creating new form of supernatural being that transcended traditional limitations, family united through blood magic that granted them collective power sufficient to reshape vampire society according to their vision of coexistence rather than domination. Marcus found himself compelled to kneel before Elena despite centuries of political maneuvering and personal ambition, his ancient will completely overruled by hybrid authority that combined vampire dominance with human creativity in ways that made resistance impossible rather than merely difficult. The council members who had come to judge Aldrich's crimes discovered they were facing new order of supernatural evolution, creatures whose mixed heritage represented future that could either elevate vampire civilization beyond predatory limitations or destroy everything they had built through millennia of careful political development. Elena stood before the assembled vampire council with silver light radiating from her hybrid eyes, her newfound authority making ancient bloodlines kneel involuntarily as she addressed centuries of supernatural law with voice that carried harmonics beyond traditional vampire frequencies. The chapel had become courtroom where she served simultaneously as defendant and judge, young woman whose mixed heritage granted her power to rewrite fundamental assumptions about species hierarchy while offering alternatives to predatory relationships that had defined vampire civilization since its inception. She began by acknowledging council authority over traditional vampire matters, while asserting that hybrid genetics placed her beyond their conventional jurisdiction, legal argument that combined supernatural law with scientific evidence about genetic evolution that transcended categories their ancient codes had established. Elena revealed Sarah's research in terms that emphasized healing rather than destruction, explaining how cure for vampire bloodlust could liberate their species from compulsive predation, while preserving supernatural abilities that made vampires uniquely valuable in cooperative relationships with human civilization. Her proposal outlined new covenant based on medical partnership rather than dominance, system where vampires could contribute supernatural physiology to human scientific advancement, while receiving blood donations through voluntary medical procedures that eliminated need for hunting and terror that had characterized traditional feeding patterns. Some council members responded with interest that surprised even Elena, ancient vampires whose centuries of hiding and isolation had grown tiresome as they watched human civilization advance beyond anything supernatural society had achieved through millennia of stagnant tradition. Lord Cassius of House Meridian spoke first in support of Elena's vision, explaining that his bloodline had grown weary of eternal conflict with humans who possessed technology and cooperation that made vampire superiority seem increasingly obsolete rather than naturally ordained. Lady Serena of House Nocturne agreed that supernatural abilities could serve humanitarian purposes more effectively than perpetuating cycles of violence that attracted unwanted attention from human governments increasingly capable of detecting and countering vampire activities through advanced surveillance and military capabilities. Elena felt momentum building as progressive council members recognized opportunity to transform vampire society from parasitic isolation into symbiotic integration that could benefit both species while eliminating existential threats that traditional predatory relationships created for supernatural communities. Marcus made final desperate attempt to maintain old order by lunging toward Elena with speed that would have overwhelmed any traditional opponent. But her hybrid powers had evolved beyond anything he could comprehend or counter through conventional vampire abilities. Elena stopped his attack without physical contact, her consciousness reaching into his mind and freezing every muscle while simultaneously broadcasting her authority to every supernatural being within miles, demonstration that made clear traditional vampire hierarchy had been permanently superseded by new form of power that combined species advantages rather than relying on single bloodline dominance. Marcus collapsed under weight of Elena's mental control, his ancient will completely overridden by hybrid authority that accessed primordial forces beyond anything pure vampire genetics could achieve, leaving him conscious but helpless, while council members witnessed transformation of supernatural law through evolutionary advancement rather than political revolution. Sarah stood beside her daughter as living proof that human-vampire cooperation could succeed, her healed body containing Aldrich's memories while maintaining human compassion that made her perfect ambassador between worlds that had viewed each other as enemies for millennia. Elena declared establishment of new supernatural order based on consent and cooperation rather than domination and fear, political structure that would integrate vampire abilities with human innovation to create advances in medicine, technology, and social organization that neither species could achieve independently. The binding ritual had created more than family reunion, had forged alliance between worlds while demonstrating that ancient prejudices could be overcome through love and sacrifice, that transcended species boundaries established by fear rather than biological necessity. Council members who had arrived expecting to witness Aldrich's execution found themselves voting to recognize Elena as legitimate heir to vampire throne, acknowledging that her mixed heritage represented evolution rather than contamination of supernatural bloodlines. Elena accepted their recognition while making clear that her authority would serve integration rather than separation, leadership dedicated to building bridges between communities rather than maintaining walls that had isolated vampires from human civilization's remarkable advances in knowledge and cooperation. Marcus retained consciousness, but lost all political power, as Elena's demonstrated superiority made traditional challenges to royal authority impossible, his defeat serving as permanent reminder that old ways of supernatural supremacy had been replaced by new paradigm of species partnership. 6 months later, Elena ruled beside Aldrich from throne room that welcomed human visitors alongside vampire courtiers, implementing gradual changes that transformed supernatural society from predatory hierarchy into cooperative alliance dedicated to advancing knowledge and healing rather than perpetuating ancient conflicts. Sarah led revolutionary medical research facility where vampires and humans worked together, developing treatments that combined supernatural biology with scientific methodology, creating advances in healing that surpassed anything either species had achieved through isolation from collaborative partnership. The facility became model for integration that Elena promoted throughout vampire territory, demonstrating practical benefits of cooperation while training new generation of supernatural and human scientists whose hybrid approaches to medical research produced breakthrough treatments for diseases that had resisted conventional therapeutic approaches. Elena established network of safe houses for mixed heritage individuals whose existence had been denied or suppressed by both human and vampire societies, creating sanctuary communities where hybrid genetics could develop naturally rather than being viewed as abomination, requiring elimination or exploitation. These communities became laboratories for social evolution as mixed heritage families demonstrated that species boundaries were artificial constructs rather than biological imperatives. Young people whose dual nature allowed them to understand both worlds while building bridges between communities that had been separated by fear and prejudice for millennia. Elena's rule transformed vampire politics from internal power struggles into external cooperation projects, redirecting supernatural abilities toward solving human problems while gaining voluntary access to resources that eliminated need for predatory relationships that had characterized traditional vampire survival strategies. Educational programs brought vampire knowledge of longevity and enhanced healing to human medical schools, while human scientific methodology helped vampires understand their own abilities in ways that enabled more precise control and application of supernatural powers for beneficial purposes rather than simply maintaining dominance over other species. Marcus remained in Elena's court as living reminder of old prejudices, while serving as example of how traditional vampire authority had been transformed through hybrid leadership that combined ancient wisdom with innovative approaches to interspecies cooperation. Elena often reflected on how single desperate request for healing blood had catalyzed transformation of two civilizations. Personal family crisis that had exposed possibilities for cooperation that neither species had previously imagined or pursued through generations of mutual mistrust and competition. The hospital where their reunion had begun became symbol of new era as medical facility expanded to accommodate both human patients and vampire researchers working together on treatments that utilized supernatural healing abilities alongside conventional therapeutic approaches, creating synthesis that advanced both species' understanding of biology and medicine. Elena's court included humans and vampires serving together as advisors and ministers. Government structure that demonstrated practical benefits of integration while providing model for other supernatural communities, considering similar transformations from isolation to cooperation with human civilization. Sarah's research continued expanding as she trained new generations of scientists whose mixed heritage allowed them to understand both supernatural and human biology. Academic programs that produced medical advances benefiting both species, while creating permanent foundation for continued cooperation between previously antagonistic communities. Elena established diplomatic relationships with human governments, whose leaders gradually learned about vampire existence through carefully managed disclosure process that emphasized potential benefits of cooperation, rather than threats posed by supernatural abilities that had remained hidden for centuries. The transformation required constant vigilance against extremist factions within both communities who preferred traditional separation to innovative integration, but Elena's demonstrated power made opposition ineffective, while her diplomatic success convinced moderate voices in both species that cooperation offered advantages that isolation could never provide. Elena and Aldrich often watched Sarah teaching mixed heritage children whose education included both human knowledge and vampire abilities. Young people who represented hope for future where supernatural and human families could coexist openly without fear of persecution or violence from either community. These children grew up understanding both worlds as natural parts of their heritage, rather than competing loyalties that required choosing between human and vampire identity. Educational approach that produced citizens capable of serving as permanent bridges between species whose cooperation could solve problems neither could address independently. The legacy of Elena's desperate midnight request had become transformation of civilizations, proof that love could overcome ancient prejudices while creating new forms of society based on mutual benefit, rather than traditional dominance relationships that had limited both species' potential for growth and advancement through collaborative effort rather than competitive isolation.